This is the specimen of cerebellum along with the brainstem. The three parts of the brainstem, mainly the medulla oblongata, above which this is the pons and this is the midbrain. The cerebellum lies in the posterior cranial fossa behind pons and the medulla oblongata. Between pons medulla in front and cerebellum behind, there is a cavity of the fourth ventricle. The cerebellum consists of two hemispheres, left and right cerebellar hemispheres. The two hemispheres are connected by a midline structure. So this midline structure is known as the vermis, which connects the two cerebellar hemisphere both on superior surface and the inferior surface. This is the superior surface of the cerebellar hemisphere and this is the superior vermis. So this part of the vermis, which connects the superior surface of the two cerebellar hemispheres, is known as the superior vermis. Whereas inferiorly there is a gap. So this gap on the inferior aspect, which is separating the inferior surface of the two cerebellar hemispheres, this gap is known as vallecula, and in the floor of vallecula lies the inferior vermis. Now the surface of the cerebellum has many fissures. So these are the fissures, and between the fissures there are leaf-like bands and they are known as folia. So there are fissures which are grooves, and between the fissure the leaf-like portion are known as the folia. Now there are three main fissures which we must identify in the cerebellum. On the superior surface, this is the superior surface, the first fissure is the primary fissure. So this fissure running across the superior surface on both the hemispheres, this is the primary fissure or the fissura prima. So the primary fissure is present on the superior surface. The second prominent fissure is the horizontal fissure. So this is the horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure separates the superior surface of the cerebellum from the inferior surface of the cerebellum. So that is the horizontal fissure. And the third fissure is seen on the inferior surface, and this fissure here is known as the posterolateral fissure. So this is the posterolateral fissure on each side. This is the posterolateral fissure. The posterolateral fissure separates the rest of the cerebellum from a small part here. This part is known as the flocculus. So this is the flocculus on this side. This is the flocculus, and the fissure which is there separating flocculus from the rest of the cerebellum is the posterolateral fissure. So posterolateral fissure is seen on the inferior surface. Then there is a horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure separates the inferior surface from the superior surface, and on the superior surface we can see here the primary fissure or the fissura prima. Now anatomically the cerebellum is divided into three lobes. The part of the cerebellum which is in front of the primary fissure, that is the fissura prima. So this part of the cerebellum is known as the anterior lobe of cerebellum. The part of cerebellum between primary fissure and posterolateral fissure, which is seen on the inferior surface. So this part of cerebellum is known as the middle or posterior lobe, and the rest of the cerebellum, which includes the flocculus and the nodule of vermis. So this lobe is the flocculonodular lobe. So these are the three anatomical lobes of the cerebellum. The anterior lobe, which is on the superior surface and it lies in front of the primary fissure. Then there is a posterior or middle lobe between primary fissure and posterolateral fissure here, and the third lobe is the flocculonodular lobe. Now here, as I told you, this is the vermis, this is the superior vermis. The superior vermis is continuous on each side with the superior surface of the corresponding cerebellar hemisphere, but inferiorly, the inferior vermis is present in the depth of the vallecula. So if we take a sagittal section of the cerebellum, this is the sagittal section of the cerebrum with cerebellum and brainstem. We can see here this appearance of the cerebellum like branches of a tree. This appearance of cerebellum is known as arbor vitae cerebelli, or the tree of life. So this appearance is the arbor vitae cerebelli. This lamina, which is going into the central core of the white matter of cerebellum, this is known as superior medullary lamina. The superior medullary lamina forms the upper part of the roof of the fourth ventricle. Now, as this section is taken in a sagittal plane, we can see this is the vermis. So starting from here, we must know the various parts of the vermis. The cranial-most part, starting from here, is the lingula. Then there is a central lobule, then culmen, declive, folium, tuber, pyramid, uvula, and the nodule. So this last part is the nodule. So the first part here is the lingula and the last part is the nodule. As we can see here, the vermis is C-shaped starting from lingula. From lingula, central lobule, culmen, declive, folium. So these are the parts of superior vermis, below which now these are the parts of inferior vermis: tuber, pyramid, uvula, and the nodule. So these four parts are the parts of inferior vermis. We can see here the cavity of the fourth ventricle and the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is formed by posterior surface of the pons and the posterior surface of upper open part of medulla oblongata. So coming back to this specimen, so on the superior surface, the superior vermis, this is the superior vermis on the superior surface. The superior vermis has the following parts, starting from lingula, central lobule, culmen, declive and folium. And the inferior vermis will consist of tuber, pyramid, uvula and nodule. Now out of these, the lingula, central lobule and culmen, they are the parts of the anterior lobe, whereas declive, folium, tuber, pyramid and uvula, they are the part of the posterior or middle lobe, whereas the last part, that is the nodule will be connected to the flocculus and form a different lobe, that will be flocculonodular lobe. Now each part of the cerebellar hemisphere is continuous with the corresponding part of vermis, Except the lingula, all the parts of the vermis will be connected to the respective parts of the cerebellar hemisphere. So if we go laterally, the first part of cerebellar hemisphere, which is connected to central lobule, so that part is known as ala of the central lobule. So ala is the part of cerebellar hemisphere which will be continuous with central lobule. After ala, the part of cerebellar hemisphere is known as anterior quadrangular lobule, which is followed by posterior quadrangular lobule. Then there is a superior semilunar lobule. Then comes the horizontal fissure, below which now this is the inferior surface. So here will be inferior semilunar lobule. Then there is a biventral lobule. Then these are the important part of cerebellar hemisphere, which is known as the tonsil. So these elevated parts, these are the known as tonsils. And then the last part is the flocculus. So this is the flocculus. So these are the parts of the cerebellar hemispheres which are connected to the respective part of the vermis. So from anterior, if we go down, so first is the ala of central lobule, then anterior quadrangular lobule, posterior quadrangular lobule, superior semilunar lobule, inferior semilunar lobule, then there is a biventral lobule, then this is the tonsil, and then there is the flocculus. So these are the various parts of cerebellar hemisphere and the corresponding part of the vermis. Now the cerebellum is connected to all the three parts of brainstem via three cerebellar peduncles: inferior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and superior cerebellar peduncle. So here we can see this is the medulla. The medulla is connected to the cerebellar hemisphere by way of inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this peduncle is inferior cerebellar peduncle. The pons is connected to the each cerebellar hemisphere by way of middle cerebellar peduncle. So this is middle cerebellar peduncle on each side. And the midbrain is connected to cerebellum by way of superior cerebellar peduncle. So this peduncle here is the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is connecting the midbrain with the cerebellar hemisphere. So here we can see this is the superior medullary velum which has been cut. The superior medullary velum, it stretches across the superior cerebellar peduncle, and if we cut the superior medullary velum, we can see the cavity of the fourth ventricle. So this is the superior medullary velum. This is the superior medullary velum, and this appearance of cerebellum is the arbor vitae cerebelli. So these are the three peduncles of the cerebellum. So that completes our external features on the cerebellum.